Thank you to Sandra, Declan and Ailish for the invitation to come along and speak to you today. It's really an honour and a joy to come to be in Dublin, where I now live, to come and talk about clinical trial transparency and the All Trials campaign this morning. As June said, I work at Sense About Science, which is the London-based campaigning charity that is all about campaigning around the use and misuse of evidence in public life. We stand up for science and we stand up for research, and we mobilise the public to ask questions about any claim they see. We really react and respond when discussions about research and evidence, or research and evidence itself, is held behind closed doors. So that's why we're particularly interested in this topic, because the results of around half of all the clinical trials that have been carried out on the medicines we use today have never been published. So we don't know what was done or what was found out in around half of all the body of clinical trials. Doctors can't be sure they're making the best decisions with their patients. Regulators and governments are at risk of making the wrong decisions, and researchers can't build on research and knowledge that's already being generated. I'm going to tell you a bit more about the issue and the problems and the implications of publication bias and lack of evidence around clinical trials, and then something about the All Trials campaign, who we are, what we've been doing, some milestones that we've hit, and the next stages, where we need to go next, what still remains to be done. But first, here's an introduction to the All Trials campaign from some of the people involved. Which sound would be perfect?
And the patients and the public, but also doctors and policymakers, they are appalled at what we've tolerated. We've had 3 decades of failing to fix this problem, and the time really has come to draw a line underneath it and fix it for good.
When I saw the doctor who gave me the diagnosis, I wanted to hear anything but the word cancer, but that didn't happen. When a couple of days later my doctor raised the possibility of a clinical trial, there wasn't really much of a decision that I felt that I had to make. I genuinely wanted some good to come out of my situation, no matter what was going to happen to me. To find out that not all clinical trials were being published is just horrifying. It's an insult to me and to everyone else who volunteers to do these trials.
Doctors have unintentionally wasted huge amounts of money on treatments which either are less effective than we thought or were unnecessarily expensive, and we've exposed patients to harm by giving them the less effective of the currently available treatment, simply because clinical trial results have been withheld from us. The best currently available evidence shows that on average the chances of a completed trial being published are roughly 50-50, and trials with positive, flattering results are about twice as likely to be published as trials with negative results.
The vast majority of medicines we use every day came on the market a decade or more ago. It's these trials where half of them haven't published results, so for the medicines we use every day, information is missing.
How can they possibly run trials in healthy volunteers, or worse, on sick people, knowing that they don't intend to make the information available?
We need immediate access to the full methods and results of all trials on all uses of all the treatments that are currently being prescribed to millions of patients today.
Hundreds of organisations who have joined the campaign, including research funders, companies and academic institutes, have started serious discussions about all they can do to achieve more transparency.
Terms like trust and transparency haven't been closely associated with the industry. And at GSK we've realised there's more we can do to be more open and transparent about the research we conduct. And if independent researchers can come along and provide a fresh perspective on the research we've done, that's great for science, it's great for us, and most importantly, it's going to improve patient care.
Clinical trials aren't just done on drugs, they're done on psychiatric treatments, medical devices, surgical techniques, and veterinary science. Anybody who funds and runs clinical trials should sign up to the campaign. Yes, it's worrying about what you might find. Everybody has skeletons in their cupboards. But now is the time for more companies and more institutes to make a commitment.
We know that withholding the results of clinical trials costs lives, wastes money, inflicts avoidable suffering and harm on patients. And so I don't think it's any longer tenable to say, we didn't know.
To make medicine better, we've got to make clinical trials count. Please share this film with friends and family and sign the petition at alltrials.net.
So that's the campaign. That's why we're doing this. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, how much do we actually know about this issue? We said in the video, around half of clinical trials haven't been published. If you're the kind of skeptical, questioning people, I'm sure many of you are, you're wondering, are we sure about that? How much do we actually know? So let's break this down a bit. The truth is, we will never have an exact number for the clinical trials that have never published results, because there is no list of all the clinical trials that have ever been carried out anywhere that we can check trials off against. We will never have an exact proportion or percentage of trials that have never published results, because we never have a denominator. And by definition, missing results, missing research is a very difficult area to research. However, there are some things that we can do and that we do know. The best lists of clinical trials that exist are clinical trial registers. Those databases, I'm sure many of you know about, set up by governments and others, where many clinical trials are captured so that we know what trials are happening where. These days, most clinical trials, though by no means all, get registered on clinical trial registers. So what researchers can do is go to those registers, identify trials on them, and then follow up those trials. Search around in the medical literature, in the grey literature, in conference reports, on the registers themselves, to see whether any results have been reported. So researchers have started to do that. Now, it would take forever to do it for all millions of clinical trials that are now on clinical trial registers. So researchers have had to focus on particular subsets of trials. So for example, research has been done looking at trials on pain, trials on particular treatments, trials done in a particular year in a particular region. Hundreds of pieces of research like that have been done now, each looking at a particular piece of the puzzle. And they all, quite consistently, are showing that around half of the body of clinical trials have never published results. Now, around half, that's not a statistic. It wouldn't be right. In fact, it's not possible to take all of those hundreds of pieces of research and synthesize them together to get one number, because they've all been done with different methodology. They've all done things like defined what they mean by published slightly differently. They've looked at trials over different time periods. They've defined trials even slightly differently, some of them. So there is no way to synthesize all of these hundreds of pieces of research together. So around half is the best that we can reasonably say. And in fact, we hope it's around half. Most of these pieces of research have been done on the EU and US clinical trial registers, where we have the most information, where there's the most rich information to use there. So what can we say about the situation in the areas of the world where researchers don't use those registers? Is the situation better or worse? We don't know. Around half is what we can best say. And looking at the issue globally, which All Trials has to do as it's a global campaign, we think around half for the entire body of clinical trials may be a conservative estimate. Now, there's no doubt the situation is getting better. Trials being run now and over the last few years are far more likely to publish results. Things are changing. However, for the vast majority, for the vast body of clinical trials, it's still around half. We also heard in the video that researchers have begun to dig a little bit deeper into the kinds of trials that don't get their results published. And we heard that trials which give negative results are twice as likely to remain hidden as trials that gave positive results. So we know that not only is a huge amount of information about medicines missing, but the information that is there is biased. It doesn't show a true picture. So what are the implications of having an evidence base that is incomplete and biased? Well, people are being harmed. Doctors can't be sure. They have no way of knowing for sure that they're prescribing the best medicines for their patients and aren't, in fact, doing them harm. Here's an example. The antiarrhythmic, the heart drug, lorcainide, was tested in clinical trials in the 1980s. The results of those trials showed that the people in the trial taking lorcainide were far more likely to die during the trial than those not taking it. But those results weren't published, not until 10 years later. And in those 10 years, doctors continued to prescribe medicines like lorcainide to their patients, it's been estimated that 100,000 people in the US alone died as a result. When trial results aren't published, doctors and regulators are at risk of making the wrong decisions. We have another dramatic example of that in Tamiflu. The MHRA, the regulator in the UK, decided to stockpile the flu drug Tamiflu in case of a flu pandemic based on the results of the trials that it had seen, which showed that Tamiflu would be effective. It spent £500 million, £500 million, stockpiling this drug. Then, some researchers saw that the regulator had only been shown the data from a proportion of all the trials that the manufacturer, Roche, had run. So the regulator had only seen a sliver of them. These researchers battled for years, working with the BMJ and others, to get this data uncovered. And when eventually all the data from all of the trials was pulled together, they saw that Tamiflu was not as effective as it seemed. In fact, it didn't seem to be any more effective than placebo. So once all the information was pulled together, it turned out that the government had wasted £500 million. When research isn't published, medics and researchers can't build on research that's already been done. New innovations aren't followed up on. All of this research knowledge that's been built is wasted. Trials get repeated unnecessarily if they don't know that they've happened or what was found out in them, wasting time, resources, money, and putting the people who volunteer for these trials unnecessarily at risk, which is massively unethical. And it betrays the trust of people who volunteer for clinical trials when results aren't shared. You all know clinical research depends on people volunteering to be part of it. These people, they give up their time, they take a risk, they take a gamble to be part of a clinical trial. They do it knowing that it may or may not help them personally to be involved in that trial, but trusting that if anything is uncovered about their condition or the treatment, that it will be shared with doctors and other researchers and used to make life better for patients like them in the future. So when results from trials aren't being shared with doctors and researchers and aren't being used to make life better for people like them, that's an enormous betrayal of their trust. Considering that clinical trials generally take hundreds, if not thousands of people, and thousands of clinical trials have never reported results, that's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of volunteers whose trust has been betrayed. When I tell people about this issue in the All Trials campaign for the first time, so many people say back to me, well, why is this happening? Isn't this against the law? And the answer is, not really. What Roche did, not sharing all of the data from all of the trials on Tamiflu, that wasn't against the law. It's not against the law to not share the results of clinical trials generally. There is no global law that says results from clinical trials need to be shared. There are some local laws, but where they exist, they're not being implemented. For example, in the US, there's the FDA Amendment Act 2007, which says that for a particular subset of US trials, they need to be registered before they begin, and they need to report results within a year of their end. It's good, that's good. That's been in existence since 2007, 2008. However, in 2015, when some researchers looked at these particular trials on the US register, they saw that only about 11% of them had published results within a year of the end of the trial. Only about 1 in 10 had followed the law. That means 9 out of 10 trials are in breach of this law. Yet no one's ever been sanctioned. No one has ever been fined. There's going to be a law in Europe soon when the new EU clinical trials regulation comes into force in 2019, I think it's due now, which again will say that most European trials will have to be registered before they begin and publish results within a year of their end. But similar laws where they exist now aren't being implemented. Will this? We hope so. There are global guidelines which mandate to researchers that they should publish results, like the Declaration of Helsinki, which many of you know is the globally agreed set of ethical standards for clinical researchers. And that says that clinical researchers have an ethical obligation to share the results of their research. Obviously, lots of researchers are in breach of this obligation and have been for years. The issue of the problems around clinical trial transparency and the issue of publication bias has been known about for more than 40 years now, and it's been discussed in academic journals and at academic conferences for all of that time. But not much happened to change this until All Trials launched in 2013. Our aim when we launched it was to bring in new voices, to bring in new people into this discussion to show that people from outside of the academic world care about this too. When I say we, I mean us at Sense About Science, along with our colleagues Ben Goldacre, the VMJ, the Cochrane Collaboration, PLOS, Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, and the James Lind Initiative. They're the founding organisations who wanted to show that all sorts of new people care about this issue to make authorities and companies and academics feel the pressure to respond. We now have nearly 100,000 people who have signed the campaign petition and more than 730 organisations, including the HRB, as Mairead said, who have all signed up to doing what they can to make clinical trials and clinical research more transparent. These are organisations all around the world. They're some of the world's largest medical bodies, clinical trial funders, government bodies, universities, student societies, consumer groups, pharma companies, and the majority of organisations that have joined are patient groups, patient support and advocacy groups, who individually represent anything from a dozen people to a couple of million, and who between them all represent the voices of more than 600 million patients worldwide. And this has gone around the world. This issue has been taken up not just by us, but by other groups of campaigners in the US, in Italy, in Spain, Norway, Spanish-speaking South America, Australia, Canada. People are joining in and taking up the issue in all sorts of different ways, in all sorts of different places. And this people power, this has had some genuinely world-changing impacts, and it's put clinical trial transparency on agendas that it's never been on before. A whole new section on transparency got added to the new EU clinical trials regulation when it was being discussed in Parliament after we mobilised thousands of European citizens to write to their MEPs. A new section on transparency was added to the Canadian government's new medicines law 2 years ago, when hundreds of people wrote to them. The US government has broadened and strengthened its laws on clinical trial reporting following challenge by us. The UK Parliament, and subsequently the UK government, committed to making clinical trial transparency a central issue for them, and the UK government has raised this at G7 meetings. The European regulator, the European Medicines Agency, agreed to a new policy to proactively publish the clinical trial information it holds after being urged to do so by hundreds of people. The UK government research regulator, the Health Research Authority, has agreed to make clinical trial registration a condition for trial approval for all UK trials. And the US federal funder, the NIH, has since January mandated that all federally funded clinical trials need to be registered before they begin and results reported from them. All of this only happened because new people were telling their representatives and telling the people they interact with and telling the people they're stakeholders of that they care about this issue and that they want something to happen. That attention has made some companies respond too. Well, I say some, there's one. GSK was the first company to join the All Trials campaign, and when they joined, they made some very strong commitments to transparency, including making anonymised data and clinical study reports publicly available from all of their global trials that they had run since their formation as a company in the year 2000. So they would go back to the year 2000 and publish all clinical study reports on the global trials they had run since then. Very strong commitments, and they've spent some time since then thinking about how they were going to fulfill those commitments, and they have started to fulfill them, in fairness. GSK doing that, joining the campaign and saying this is important to us, and starting to think out loud about how it was going to fulfill its commitments in a very public and open way, and inviting many different people to feed in on what it should and could be doing, and to learn from its mistakes and its moves forward, was very, very important for the campaign. It showed just that it was possible for an enormous global pharma company to change, to say, this is an issue that's important to us, and to pivot to make sure it was important and to embed it in everything they do. It showed just what was reasonable to expect from a global company like that. It looked at the information it held, it looked at what it had, legal, technical, resource implications about releasing it, and figured out solutions to those problems. It showed just what was practicable, and it brushed away many of the excuses and problems and barriers and reasons not to do this that we were hearing from other companies, and especially from the industry trade bodies towards the beginning of this campaign. For example, the industry bodies would tell decision makers and politicians that it's impossible to proactively, publicly publish clinical study reports because they include information which would breach patient confidentiality. Well, GSK were able to take their clinical study reports, which are those sometimes thousands of page long reports, and found that in general, it came down to a couple of paragraphs that might contain information that might lead to a breach in patient confidentiality. And they showed that those couple of paragraphs were easy and cheap to redact, and that it was still possible to publish an almost complete CSR with very, very little risk. So GSK, taking this seriously and looking at what was practical and possible, just slew away so many of the arguments against this that we were hearing from industry. And it was very important for the campaign when they came on board. Since then, they've gone ahead and built a new platform that they've been using to share the CSRs and share anonymized patient data from trials. And 11 other companies have now joined in and are also telling us what they're going to do and just how much they're going to share. Some other companies have made some good commitments and made some good moves too. For example, Johnson & Johnson and Bristol Myers Squibb, two US companies, have both decided to hand over all of their clinical trial data, just all of it, to groups of independent researchers. So Johnson & Johnson are working with a group at Yale, and Bristol Myers Squibb are working with a group of researchers at Duke University in the US. They've handed over their data to those researchers, said you can run projects on that, and you guys can then look after giving other researchers access to our data. It's out of our hands. So that seems to be working. Leo Pharma was the first pharma company to say they would make sure that all their trials were registered so that everybody could see all that they've done, at the very least, which was a big move. So why are companies doing this? Well, they're doing it to prevent further deaths and suffering, of course. They're doing it to improve the evidence base and improve medicine, without a doubt. They're certainly doing it to protect their revenues against fines for being caught out withholding important information. Certainly to protect their revenues against that day when payers are going to start making decisions about which medicines they'll pay for based on the transparency of the evidence base. I think that day is coming. Companies are doing this definitely to demonstrate responsibility and to try and bolster and protect their reputations. But they're certainly doing it because one very important stakeholder is beginning to ask them to, and that's their major shareholders. So 82 investment groups have joined the All Trials campaign. These are investment groups like massive banks like BNP Paribas, investment houses like AXA Insurance and Aviva, asset managers like Boston Commons Asset Management. The 30 UK local authority pension groups joined in, and the investment arm of the Wellcome Trust are part of this too. These are people who all have holdings in major global pharma companies. They all hold shares or have invested in these companies. And between them, they have investment capital worth more than 3.5 trillion euros at their disposal. So these are people who, when they phone up the CEOs of a company they have shares in, the CEO listens. So now they have said that transparency is important to us because it's a scientific and moral and ethical right thing to do, but also because we as investors don't like the idea of skeletons in cupboards that might one day come out and change the value of the company we invest in. Investors don't like surprises. They want to know that they know everything there is to know about the companies they invest in. So they joined the campaign, and we're now helping them with the right questions to ask the companies they invest in and helping them ask particular companies to do particular things. So we audited the top 50 global pharma companies' policies on clinical trial transparency, and we're using what we found there to equip their shareholders to ask the companies to do better. Ben will tell you more about the audit later on, so I won't get into any more details on that. But the publicity and the people power and the discussions around all trials, we've changed structures at some of the highest levels in society now. In 2015, the WHO declared that, as far as it was concerned, all researchers had an ethical obligation to publish results from clinical trials. In 2016, the UN urged all world governments to bring in laws to mandate clinical trial registration and results reporting. For the first time those two intergovernmental organizations said something about this. The WHO has continued, the World Health Organization has continued to make clinical trial transparency a core issue for it. It's now started working with massive global non-commercial trial funders to help them adopt new and strong policies about clinical trial transparency. So the WHO published a very strong policy on clinical trial reporting, which says, in a nutshell, that all clinical trials need to be registered, that they need to report publicly results within a year or so of their end, and that anybody who applies for funds from clinical trial funders should be asked to declare their publishing record, and ideally have all their clinical trials published before they get money to do a new trial. So some enormous funders, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Médecins Sans Frontières, the Wellcome Trust, the NIHR in the UK, and about a dozen others, have joined this statement from the WHO and said they're going to adopt that really strong clinical trials policy. So from now on, trials, or from in about a year's time on, I should say, trials funded by those enormous funders will have to be registered, will have to publish results, and researchers applying to those big funders to run trials will have to be transparent. There's no longer any excuse. There's no longer any excuse. Excuses against transparency in clinical trials have been swept off the table at this stage. Companies like GSK and Johnson & Johnson have shown us what's possible. Funders like NIH and Wellcome have shown us what's possible. The WHO and the UN have shown us what's expected. There's no more excuses. So we're at that stage where Mairead identified earlier, where if you're asking people to do something, you've got to help them to do it. So we're now giving the tools to be more transparent to people involved in clinical trial research. So working with groups from all the different sectors in clinical trial running and reporting in that ecosystem, we've built a roadmap for change, which sets out for each of those, for organizations in each of those 13 sectors, just what it is you can do to lock in clinical trial transparency in your sector. And it includes examples of initiatives that are already in place by other, probably forward-thinking organizations within each sector. And that's what we're all about at All Trials. Encouraging the organizations and the bodies who have a role in this, or have a stake in this, or have something going on in their backyard related to this, to take responsibility for their own sectors, to take responsibility to illuminate the situation in each of their sectors and do something to make it better. We're saying every organization, in fact, every researcher has a responsibility to improve reporting rates. We're going to help people do it. We are helping people do it with our roadmap for change, and we're helping and advising an awful lot of people. But we're also saying now that if we don't do it, we're going to come and call you out on that. The next stages of the All Trials campaign are about building more accountability, about holding people and organizations to account for not doing this, for not moving towards transparency, and for not reporting their trials. We'll be doing that in lots of different ways. And again, this is what Ben's going to be talking about predominantly this afternoon, using tracker tools and auditing tools to start to identify very specifically where the gaps are. So, we know we've had an impact with All Trials. We know we've generated a lot of publicity. We've published interesting reports. We've challenged regulators. We've challenged governments, challenged companies. We've agitated for change among enormous funders and bodies. Now we have to turn all of that impact into real results. We need to move from talking about policies to actually moving towards practice. And it's getting really urgent. It's getting urgent. Every day, more results are lost. When people retire and when software goes obsolete, results disappear into the ether and will never be found again. So our focus is on results from old trials. I've set out some of how the future is going to be different. There's going to be new European law. There's going to be, I hope, a stronger and implemented US law. The culture is changing in so many different ways. Practice is changing in so many different ways that from now on, a lot more clinical trial results will be available. But that doesn't do anything to deal with the mess behind us in the past. That whole body of trials where around half of them still haven't published results. And those are very, very important trials because most of you know that the medicines we use today have been on the vast majority of medicines that we use today have been on the market for a decade or more, therefore must have been tested in clinical trials in the decades before that. And it's those decades-old trials where many of them haven't published results. But not only are those old trials important because they contain information about current medicines, they also have an impact on future medicines. New medicines, cost effectiveness and effectiveness is assessed against what we know about currently used medicines. But if we don't know everything we need to know about medicines we're using today, how can we be sure that we make right decisions about medicines we're going to use in the future? So we really have to get these old trials published. It's not just because it's on paper the right thing to do, or it's not just because it's a messy situation if we don't have them. It's vital if we want to be sure that we know everything we need to know about our medicines. So what we're going to start doing is identifying specific unreported trials and asking the people responsible for them to report them. We'll be using tools like this trials tracker, which is developed by Ben's team up in Oxford, which can automatically identify unreported trials. There's a lot to be said about how we're defining reported here and unreported and so on, but Ben will get into that this afternoon. What we're going to do is start producing some specific and live numbers and proportions of trials that have gone unreported in different sectors for different diseases, for different treatments in different countries, for different sponsors, for different institutions, and for different researchers. And we'll be writing to the people responsible for these unreported trials and asking them what their plan to report is. We'll help them, but if they're not forthcoming about it, we might have to stop helping them. We're going to be applauding the leaders. We're going to be applauding the people who are doing well and encouraging people who are reporting their trials to start telling the rest of us how they managed it and what it took. But we will be putting a name to those researchers and those institutions which aren't reporting. And I'll tell you now, if any of you are sitting on unreported trials, I would get them out soon. Take this opportunity to go and talk to your boss and say, we need to get this published. Because if you don't, we're going to come after you. Thank you.